Welcome to Art Ed Radio, the podcast for art teachers. This show is produced by The Art of Education, and I'm your host, Tim Bogatz. Now, a couple weeks ago, I was in Seattle for the NAEA National Conference, and I don't want to talk about it too much, because if you were there, you were there, and if you weren't, you probably don't want to hear too much about it. But I will tell you that it was a pretty good time, and I love a lot of the experiences that we all have when we go to conferences, whether that's state, national, even just local things that you may be doing. Anytime you can get together with other art teachers, it's a wonderful thing. And, it's something that I talked about with Debbie West a few weeks ago on the podcast, the importance of making those professional connections. And I made a new connection that I'm pretty excited about. It's Maggie Maggio, and she knows more about color than honestly pretty much anybody I've ever met. And you'll hear the interview today. But let me back up just a little bit before we dive in here. Because a few years ago, when I was just a writer for AOE, it seems weird, right? This is like pre-podcast days, no videos, no grad courses. I was just writing articles. But I was able to write one about Colormondo's color globes. And if you haven't checked out Colormondo before, you absolutely should. They make these incredible globes that are the best visual I've seen that demonstrates color in 3 dimensions. And kids can put them together and they show hue, value, and chroma like all in a globe. It's super cool. And I don't want to get into the weeds too much here, but I'll just say that I was able to write an article that was called A Revolutionary Tool for Teaching Color. So feel free to check that out or check out the Colormondo website to see what that's all about. But anyway, I'm telling you that because when I was in Seattle, I stopped by the Colormondo booth to see what was up with them, to say hello to Nicolene from Colormondo, who I worked with for that article, see what's new with them. And Nicolene introduced me to Maggie, and we hit it off immediately. Maggie and I have just this shared love of all things color, obviously, and we had some really good conversations about how we teach it, what we could be doing differently, and how we can get teachers to kind of go beyond just that basic idea of mixing red, yellow, and blue. So she agreed to come on the podcast. And what's kind of unique about this is that we talked for so long that we're actually going to split it into 2 different podcasts. So you'll hear the first part of it today, and then we'll do the second part of the interview next week. So if you love color theory and everything related to teaching color, you're going to love the next 2 weeks. And if not, I don't know, you can check back at the end of April, I guess. But before we get to it, I want to tell you about a couple more awesome color resources from AOE that are worth your time to check out. They're both learning packs from the Art Ed Pro library. First one is Diving Deep into Color Theory, which is with Johanna Russell. She has so many great ideas about teaching color theory and practical application in the classroom. It also has 12 or 13 different downloads that you're absolutely going to love and use when you're teaching color theory. The second learning pack is from friend of the pod, Andrea Sluzarski, and it's called Exploring Color Theory Through Watercolor, which is kind of an interesting, kind of a cool way to do it. That one has 20 videos, 10 downloads, and Slu takes you through basic techniques, advanced ideas, and everything in between. Plus, she gives you some awesome lessons that are ready for your classroom right now. So check out both of those learning packs at theartofed.com/pro. And if you haven't signed up yet, go get started on your 30-day free trial. You're going to love it. Again, that's theartofed.com/pro. All right, I've been talking long enough, and you probably need to hear another voice, so let me play the first part of the interview with Maggie. And Maggie Maggio is joining me now. Maggie, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, Tim. Thanks for asking. It's exciting to be talking to you.
Oh, awesome. I am excited to have you. I'm excited to kind of dive into color theory and I guess how we teach color theory. So let's just kind of start with a quick introduction. So, can you talk about how you got started with teaching color, why you're so passionate now about teaching color, and I guess some of the things that you're particularly interested in at the moment?
Oh, yes, sure, Tim, thanks. I started teaching color workshops about 25 years ago to adult artists. And mostly I wanted to share what I was learning about color mixing. At the time, color mixing was still a mystery to me, and learning how to actually get the colors I wanted was something that I felt uh, came out of the old red, yellow, blue tradition and wasn't working. So I had started to look at what was called the double primary system and all these other ways to mix colors. I discovered I could make a red from a yellow and a magenta. That set off a whole series of questions in my head about, what is it that we've learned about color and what is right and what is wrong and what works and what doesn't work. Um, I started using just the cyan, magenta, yellow, and that was when the aha moment came, and I started to teach adult artists. And why am I so passionate about it? It's because, well, it works, number one. And, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And number two, it was, uh, I kept hearing from my adult students their level of frustration with color mixing, and then taking the class, and they would come out of it and say, this works so much better. Why did we learn about red, yellow, blue in grade school? And my answer was usually, well, that's the traditional way to teach it. This is what we've known for a long time. We didn't have the products up until recently to do the cyan, magenta, yellow. It comes out of photography. It comes out of printing. Uh, and and yes, they're still learning it in school now. And maybe 25 years ago, there was no way to introduce it. There were no student grade products available. So I'd explain, well, there's reasons why it's still being taught. It can't change yet. So why am I passionate now? I'm passionate now because there are the products available. We have started this revolution already with printing and in all kinds of areas. So now is the time. We can make this transition now, and we can make it so that color mixing is not frustrating for anyone, and not for the teachers, not for the students. So this is why I get very excited about making that change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, the place to start is with teachers, because like you said, there's so much frustration out there when kids are mixing, so many different colors that just aren't what they want. It becomes so frustrating for them. And I think there are a lot more avenues out there. So I guess, can we talk a little bit about how, we teach color theory, like as art teachers, how we do this? Because like for me personally, I used to think that red, yellow, blue is fine for our youngest kids. And then as we get a little more advanced, we make that shift to working with cyan, magenta, and yellow. And now I guess I'm kind of thinking that everybody should be doing CMY. But can you talk a little bit about your views about, I guess, the traditional ways that we teach color theory, and maybe a little bit about how and why things can shift, or why they should shift in what we're doing in the classroom?
Yeah, sure, Tim. I've spent quite a bit of time over the last few years looking at how we are teaching children about color. And, it has become rather formalized over the years. And, it starts with learning your color names. And you do that maybe even before preschool. There's four things that all the kids are supposed to know before they go to school. They're supposed to know how to count. They learn their numbers. They learn the alphabet. That's going to be for math literacy. That's going to be for language literacy. They need to know, often in these core concepts, they add knowing the colors and shapes, knowing the names of colors, knowing the names of shapes. That's a visual literacy. That's going to help them explain the world to themselves and to everyone else. It's a way to look and see. So in the very beginning, they're learning color names, and they're learning these basic color terms that we all kind of learn: the black and the white and the red and the yellow, the green, the blue, the rainbow colors. What they're not learning are these names that have to do with what I call 21st century color. They're not learning cyan. They're not learning magenta. That's one of those basic color naming pieces that could change and maybe should change at some point. But it's a real toughie because what does cyan look like really? We're starting to learn it because of the printers. We're beginning to see cyan or cyan blue is somewhere between turquoise and ultramarine. We're beginning to understand magenta as a color that's yes, it's pink, it's purple, but it's its own thing. It's magenta, and so that's kind of the beginning of it. So that teaching of color comes before kids even come into school. So then, as an art teacher, you've already, that's what you're given. You're given this basic understanding of color naming, and you put out in the classroom these colors for kids to play with. And at some point, then the next step is you start teaching color mixing, the idea that one color can go with another color to make a third color, and that's where this institutionalized teaching of red, yellow, blue comes in. And we say, okay, at the time we start teaching color mixing, we're going to pull out red, yellow, blue. And I say, let's supplement that. You don't have to replace it, but let's supplement it with letting kids play with cyan, magenta, yellow. And, they'll get it. They'll get that they're getting colors that are really bright and beautiful. That's a step in the teaching of color. And then another step is the teaching of color moving from dark to light. You always do this exercise. So you pick one color and you mix it with some white and some black and some, hopefully with something in between, some gray. So each of those steps, I think, are presented pretty much maybe even every year. Would you say, you have to do this refresher? Is that something you've done in?
Yeah, I think most teachers, unfortunately, go back to the color wheel over and over. They go back to their value scales over and over because for, whatever reason, it's something that just doesn't stick with kids.
Yeah. So there's two things that I want to say right here. And that is, yes, here it is as a lesson that we're preparing and giving to the kids almost every year. And yet it doesn't work. At least the red, yellow, blue doesn't work. And no wonder they feel like they have their hands tied behind their back and maybe they don't like art. This doesn't work. And yet, boom, they get so little art. And what we give them is something that doesn't work. So that makes no sense, first of all. So that's one good reason to bring in this cyan magenta to the classroom. And then, also the second point is when you limit it to this series of, first you learn the names, then you learn, color mixing using some primary colors, and then you learn the tints, shades, and tones. What you haven't done is you haven't put it into a framework that makes sense to the kids, something that's sticky, as you call it. And what's sticky is if you start to see it in 3 dimensions. So this is, if we talk about how we're teaching, one of the big things, and we've had this conversation before, is one of the big things is to start thinking of it always as this 3-dimensional model.
Yeah. Okay. So, sorry to interrupt you here, but I think this would be a good spot. When you and I talked, you had this, I don't want to hype it up too much, but this kind of magical explanation of, how color comes in 3D. So can you talk or kind of share that explanation of how people can visualize color in 3 dimensions? Like if you look at it like a globe, like what does it look like to organize and kind of give a system to all of that color?
Yes, great. So it's not a new concept. The idea of seeing color in 3 dimensions is centuries old, but it's not something we're real familiar with. Sometimes you do see it in a book. Color Mondo is the system that we saw when we were up in Seattle at the National Education Association conference. So the 3D system, and this, I'm going to go through a visualization that actually comes out of Albert Munsell. And that is to think of color as a globe. Think of it as in the classroom, every classroom used to have a globe. I don't know if they still do. But if color is a globe, then the North Pole would represent white, and the South Pole would represent black. And the axis that runs between the North Pole and the South Pole, going through the center of the Earth, that represents the sequence of grays or neutral colors that go from the dark to the light. So there, the dark to the light, all those neutral colors are running down the center. And then around the equator, around the center of that globe, is that band of colors that represent the hues that we think of as the rainbow colors. We want to expand the rainbow to include magenta. So we have all these colors, red, yellow, blue, coming around the equator. If you start looking at it that way, you can see that if we're going to move colors, we're going to move colors in three directions. We're going to move, say, a red color up toward white, and it's going to get tinted out. It's going to get lighter and lighter. We can take a red and we can move it down toward the dark, and it's going to get, progressively darker. And we can take a color, the red, and move it in toward that center gray color, and it's going to get progressively, less and less bright until it's become very muted and almost neutral. Every color moves in those three directions, and that's the typical tint, shade, and tone exercise that you do in a classroom. So if you think of that exercise as being that slice through the globe, every color has that slice that goes through the globe, and once you build it all together, you've got the full kind of three dimensions of color. Did that make sense?
That does make sense to me. I'm hoping it makes sense to our listeners too, but I think it's a great explanation. Yeah. No, I think it's a great way to visualize things. And, also I wrote an article about Color Mondo that you mentioned a couple years back, which is a great way to visualize this, to allow kids to visualize that. So we'll link to that in the podcast notes so everybody can kind of check that out a little bit more. But I actually want to go back to something you talked about previously, which was, how we need to supplement what we're teaching with color theory. It's not just about mixing colors. Like, color theory goes beyond mixing colors. There's a lot more that kids can learn. And so can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? And maybe, can you speak to what you see coming on the horizon? Like, what's out there in the future when it comes to teaching color theory?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we look at those steps, they would be supplementing what's in the classroom so that students can explore, experiment with cyan, magenta, and yellow. And then the second step is to shift to something that's a 3D so that you can actually see colors in relationship to each other. And I would say that is getting close to the cutting edge. Is this, I would call it building a strong foundation based in this three-dimensional image of color, so that everything you teach about color theory is somehow connected to this three-dimensional model. And what I mean by that is this scaffolding of education. So if you start with the 3D model, every time you present a color theory lesson, you can relate it to the model. So, for example, if you want to talk about value contrast, and how important value contrast is to the legibility, being able to read a piece of artwork so that it works. You can go to this three-dimensional model and say, look, here we have it. We have dark to light. How can you tell what the value contrast is? You can find that where the color lives in the color model and say, yes, we've got enough value contrast. A piece of that is we kind of mislead students when we say that all the pure colors are they kind of live in the same place in a color model. Well, they around the equator, but they really don't. There's actually this concept of a tilted equator, and that means if you push that equator so yellow moves up toward white and blue moves down toward dark, now we understand that all those pure colors have a different value. And by value, I mean how much light or dark, how much light is reflected by the color. So this that's one area. And then another area is this idea, the concept of warm and cool. If you're going to teach the concept of warm and cool colors, that has to do with some colors are visually stronger than others. Warm colors are visually stronger, cool colors are a little bit weaker. And so you can show that, we've got the warm colors over here, they're going to push, and you've got the cool colors and they're going to kind of fade into the background. That's a piece that is more advanced kind of color theory, and it's scaffolded as you go through, and you present each of these kind of theories in a series.
All right. I think that's a good stopping point right there. A good break in the interview. And as I told you earlier, we'll run the second part of the interview with Maggie next week. Now, in the meantime, I have something else that I want you to check out. Maggie is part of the Inter-Society Color Council, which is just this huge group that is dedicated to color and teaching about color. And they have an entire symposium called the Munsell Centennial Color Symposium coming up in June. It honors Albert Munsell, who Maggie referenced earlier. I will link it in the show notes, but you can find all of the information and a really cool website for the symposium at munsell2018.org. And as part of their conference, as part of their symposium, they have a call for artwork that is open right now. It's called Celebrating Color, and it is open to all ages and all media. Now, the deadline is the end of the month here at the end of April, April 30th. So there's plenty of time for your students or for you to still enter. I know she would love to see what you're doing. We'll also link to that call for artwork, and you can check out some of the submissions on Instagram at Munsell2018. It's an opportunity that I would definitely encourage you to check out. Like I said, either for your students or for yourself. But I think that is it for this week. We'll be back next week with part 2 of the interview, and we will talk to you then. Art Ed Radio is produced by The Art of Education with audio engineering from Michael Crocker. Keep exploring color theory. We have podcasts, articles, links in the show notes, pro learning packs, everything you need. So keep yourself busy for the next few days, and we will wrap up this topic next Tuesday. We'll see you then.